Welcome back to science class. My name is Miss Rillieux, and this week we will be discussing prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells. Now, if you joined me last week, we discussed or finished our series on food chains and food webs. So before we begin with this week's session, let's review what we did last week in regards to food chains and food webs. So to review what we did last week, we will play Jeopardy! So vocabulary for 100. An organism that eats only meat. Yes, an organism that eats only meat is called a carnivore. Very good. Vocabulary for 200. An organism that makes its own food. Now, there are two words that you can use here. So can you find me one word? Correct. An organism that makes its own food is called a producer, but another word for a producer is an autotroph. Vocabulary for 300. An organism that eats only plants. Right. An organism that eats only plants is called an herbivore. Vocabulary for 400. An organism that eats both plants and animals. You are correct. An organism that eats both plants and animals is called an omnivore. That is what we all are. We are all omnivores. And then last, vocabulary for 500. And a diagram that shows the flow of energy from one organism to another. Yes, that diagram is called a food chain. So great job so far. Let's see if we can identify the correct vocabulary word in our second column called vocabulary 2. So vocabulary 2 for 100, an animal that eats plants or other animals. Yes, that would be a consumer. Vocabulary 2 for 200, an organism that breaks down dead or decaying plant or animal material. Yes, you are correct. That answer is a decomposer. Vocabulary 2 for 300, a network of food chains that have some links in common. Absolutely. That answer is a food web. Vocabulary 2 for 400, the struggle between organisms for the same resource. Correct. When organisms struggle for the same resource, we call that competition. And then last one, vocabulary 2 for 500, non-native plant or animal species that have been introduced into an environment. And the key here is the non-native. So they are not typically part of the environment. Yes, if they are not typically part of the environment, we call them an exotic species. Great job. So we have so far completed vocabulary column, vocabulary 2 column, and now we're going to move on to food chains and more. So food chains and more for 100. A model that shows how much energy flows through a food web. Yes, that is called a food pyramid. And it shows that the organisms at the bottom of the pyramid have the most energy and the organisms at the top of the pyramid have less energy. Because as we transfer energy from one organism to the next, only about 10% of that energy is being transferred. Therefore, the ones at the top have less, the ones at the bottom have more. All right, the next one says, consider this food chain: grass, grasshopper, mouse, snake. Which organism in this food chain is an herbivore? Now remember, the definition of an herbivore means that you only eat plants. So within this food chain, what organism would be considered the herbivore? Yes, the organism that would be considered the herbivore would be the grasshopper. Food chains and more for 300. Now consider this food chain: blackberries, bird, cat. Which organism is a carnivore? Now remember, the definition of a carnivore means that you only eat meat. So if an organism only eats meat, which organism in this food chain would be considered the carnivore? Correct again. The carnivore within this food chain would be the cat. Food chains and more for 500. Consider this food chain: acorns, squirrels, hawk. Which of these is a producer? First, do you know what a producer is? And can you tell me? Yes, a producer is an organism that makes its own food. And another name for a producer is an autotroph. So now that we know the correct definition of a producer, which organism in this food chain would be considered the producer? Great job. The producer in this food chain would be the acorns. And then food chains and more for 500. In Mississippi, swamp, alligators, and great blue herons eat fish. What type of organism is a great blue heron? Is it a decomposer, a carnivore, an herbivore, or a producer? Correct. In this food chain, in the Mississippi swamp, the heron would be considered a carnivore because it is eating fish. So far, we've completed and done correctly vocabulary, vocabulary 2, and food chains and more. So now let's move on to our wild card column. This means it could be anything that we've learned over the past 3 weeks about food chains, food webs, and the vocabulary associated with the two of them. So let's go with wild cards for 100. Why are decomposers important organisms in a food chain? Is it because a food web? Is it because of A, they produce oxygen, B, they prey on carnivores, C, they are food for producers, or D, they return nutrients back to the soil? So out of those 4, which one correctly identifies a decomposer? Yes, the decomposer would be D. They return nutrients to the soil. Wild card for 200. Consider the food chain: grass, grasshopper, frog, snake. What would happen in an ecosystem if the grasshopper population died? Well, in order to answer this question correctly, you first have to identify who in the food chain eats the grasshopper and whom in the food chain does the grasshopper eat. So let's start with the first one. What does the grasshopper eat in this food chain? Yes, in this food chain, the grasshopper eats grass. Now that we know what the grasshopper eats in this food chain, what organism in this food chain eats the grasshopper? Correct again. The organism that eats the grasshopper in this food chain is the frog. So now that we know what the grasshopper eats and what eats the grasshopper, now we can answer this question correctly. So A states A, snakes would eat the grasshopper. B, it would be fine. The frog prefers other insects anyway. C, it would be fine. The grass population would increase. Or D, the frog population would die from a decrease in their food supply. Right. The answer to this question would be D. The frog population would die from a decrease in their food supply. If there's no grasshoppers, then the frogs do not have anything to eat in this scenario. So therefore, they will die. Now, again, this is hypothetical. Frogs eat more than grasshoppers. So, of course, the frogs would not die in a real environment because they would just eat a different source. But some of them might, because there would be more competition for those other resources. Wild card for 300. Which is true regarding an energy pyramid? A, carnivores occupy a larger level than herbivores. B, herbivores occupy a smaller level than producers. C, consumers occupy the level below producers. Or D, producers and carnivores occupy the same level. So we're looking for the true statement. Yes, the statement that is true in this one is B. Herbivores occupy a smaller level than producers. Wild card for 400. Which of the following organism is a secondary consumer in a food chain? So a secondary consumer, what does that mean? Yes, a secondary consumer means that organism eats the primary consumer. So out of these 4, which organism typically eats the primary consumer? Right. The organism that eats the primary consumer typically is the hawk. The squirrel typically eats producers. The earthworm is typically a decomposer, and the gorilla most likely is going to be a top predator. And then wild card for 500. A certain type of bear mainly eats trout. If the trout population declines, what most likely will happen to the bear population? So would it be A, it would decrease, B, it would increase, C, it would remain the same, or D, it would increase and decrease? Well, this is easy. What would happen to you, or what would happen to humans if we did not have as much food as we have now? Yes, whenever you remove an organism's amount of food, their population will decrease. Wild card 2 for 100. Can an organism be part of more than one food chain? A, no, because it can't be a predator and a prey at the same time. B, no, because the arrows in the food web can only flow in one direction. C, yes, because it can be a prey for more than one organism. Or D, yes, because it may live in more than one environment. Absolutely. The answer to this question is C, because it can be a prey for more than one organism. As we saw in that previous question, frogs most likely eat more than just grasshoppers. So they are predators for more than just the grasshopper. Along with the grasshopper is probably eaten by more than just frogs. So the grasshopper is prey for multiple organisms, not just the frog. And the frog is predator for more than one organism, not just the prey. That's typical. And that's how organisms survive. Although there will be a decrease if the food is removed or the organism is removed, but they'll just most likely eat more of another organism or be prey for more than one organism. Wildcard 200. Which type of organism is fungi or fungus? Yes, fungus is really, really small. So fungus is a decomposer. The purpose of them is to return that nutrients back to the soil for those plants to be producers to provide food for our primary consumers. Wildcard 2 for 300. When a frog eats a grasshopper, how much grasshopper's energy is transferred to the frog? Yes, the amount of energy that is transferred from one organism to the next in a food chain is always going to be 10%. Wildcard 2 for 400. How does a food chain start again after the decomposer does its job? A, because the decomposer spreads the seeds. B, because the decomposer must constantly stay busy to stay alive. C, because the decomposer breaks down dead or decaying organisms down and the nutrients go back to the soil, causing any seeds that have been dispersed a good environment to reproduce. Or D, because the decomposer does not totally break the organism down and some organism is still alive. Right. The answer to this question is C. The purpose of a decomposer is to get that nutrients back into the soil. And then our last question for 500. In a Mississippi swamp ecosystem, what would you expect an alligator or a fish population to be? Would you expect the alligator or the fish population to be bigger? So A, fish, because they feed more predators. B, fish, because alligators can't see them very well. C, alligators, because they're at the top of the food chain. Or D, alligators, because they have to eat a lot. So which one do we expect there to be more of? Right. The answer to this question is what is A, because fish feed on more predators. If you're able to get food, you're going to be able to reproduce and you're going to be able to grow your population. On the other hand, if you cannot get a lot of food, you're most likely going to die. All right. So now that we have reviewed food chains and food webs from our last 2 or 3 weeks together, now let's get into this week's session. So again, for this week, our focus is going to be students will be able to identify the basic characteristics of organisms, including prokaryotic and eukaryotic, unicellular and multicellular, autotroph or heterotroph, and a mode of reproduction that further classifies them into their currently recognized kingdoms. Now, this week, similar to the last few weeks, this will be a multi-series. So today we're going to focus on prokaryotic and eukaryotic, and next week we'll do the rest of this teak. So our essential question for this week, why is it necessary to understand how the individual parts of a complex structure work? So we need to understand how does the domains work, the kingdoms, how does this all work together in order to create a viable environment for organisms? All right, so our agenda for today. The first thing we're going to do is go through types of cells foldable, then guided practice, cell type sort, independent practice, quizzes, and then last but not least, our STAR practice questions. The materials you will need for today's session just include paper, pencil, and scissors. And then to make your foldable, you're going to take your paper, fold it in half, hamburger style, and then you're going to take your scissors, cut one half in half, and that'll give you with these two flaps that you see on your screen. On one flap, you want to label it prokaryotic, and on the other flap, you want to label it eukaryotic. Now, do not worry about the spelling. There will be a slide that'll show you the spelling. So if you want to leave it blank for now, that's fine. But again, what I need you to do is to take your paper, fold it in half, hamburger style, and then take one half of that paper, cut it in half, and that'll give you two flaps, and you'll label your two flaps prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, because that's what we're talking about today. So are you ready to begin? All right, well, let's get started. So before we talk about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, we need to talk about why cells are important. So the reason cells are important is because of cell theory. Now, cell theory is broken up into three parts. The first one, all living things are made up of cells. So that means everything that is living has to have a cell, at least one. If something does not have a cell, then we do not consider it living. And we discussed that when we talked about abiotic and biotic factors. The second part of cell theory, cells are the basic unit of structure and function. Again, that just means that everything comes from a cell. Cells are the foundation. And the third one is new cells come from existing cells. So if you need to make a new cell, it has to come from a cell. It can't come from a box because boxes do not have cells. So the three parts of cell theory. First thing, everything living has a cell, at least one. So if it has at least one cell, no matter how small, no matter how simple, it is living as long as it has one cell. Cells are the foundation for everything. And then last but not least, in order to make more cells, they have to come from a cell. So they have to come from a pre-existing cell. So now that we know why cells are so important, let's talk about the characteristics of all cells. So all cells have a cell membrane. And when we talked about the organelles of cells, we learned that a cell membrane allows materials to enter the cell, but also prevents materials from leaving the cell. The second thing that all cells must have is DNA. So DNA tells the cell what to do. It's kind of the controller. So it has a genetic code and it tells the cell what it needs to do. And then last but not least, all cells must have cytoplasm. So cytoplasm is the organelle that's kind of like the floor of the cell, and it is what everything else sits on top of. So because of that, cytoplasm is kind of sticky. And so because it's sticky, it allows everything, all other organelles to sit on top of it. So again, no matter what type of cell we talk about today, if we're talking about a prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell, they all have these three things in common. They have a cell membrane to allow things in and out the cell. They have DNA, and then they also have a cytoplasm. So now that we know that, let's keep going. So there are two general types of cells. All cells are one of the two. They're either prokaryotic cells or eukaryotic cells. So now you can label your foldable prokaryotics or eukaryotic. All right, so now that we have our labels on our foldable, let's talk about prokaryotic. So a prokaryotic cell does not have a nucleus, and that is going to be the biggest identifier of a prokaryotic cell. We will not see the nucleus, which is an organelle that we typically see in cells that you talk about in class or when we're talking about cell organelles. So prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, and a nucleus is typically the control center of the cell or the brain if we're comparing it to something in our bodies. But prokaryotic cells do not have it. They just have DNA, but that DNA is not in the nucleus. Now, because a prokaryotic cell does not have a nucleus and has DNA just kind of floating around, it's really small. And the reason it's really small is because it's not that complex. So it's less complex than the next type of cell that we're going to talk about. Also, prokaryotic cells typically do not have a lot of membrane bound organelles. So like a nucleus, a vacuole, a endoplasm reticulum or a chloroplast. It doesn't have those organelles. And so an example of a prokaryotic cell is bacteria. If you've ever seen bacteria under a microscope, you know it's super small, not very complex. And so that would be a prokaryotic cell. So again, the biggest thing we want to take away from this slide, because what they're going to ask us is, how do we know? How can we tell the difference between the two? Because they're both cells, right? And if you are bacteria, you are living, right? Because although bacteria may not walk and talk, it is living because it is made up of cells, sometimes just one cell, but it is made up of cells. And anytime you are made up of a cell, you are living. So bacteria is living. And we want to remember that bacteria is a prokaryotic cell. And that just means that it doesn't have a nucleus, but it does have DNA. It's smaller and less complex, and it doesn't typically have a lot of organelles. So these are the things that you should be writing in your foldable. I'll give you about 10 more seconds, and then we'll move on to our second type of cell. All right, so now that we know what a prokaryotic cell is, let's talk about eukaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells is what we have in our body. We are all made up of eukaryotic cells, millions of them. So what's the difference? Again, the big identifier of a eukaryotic cell is it has a nucleus. And not only does it have a nucleus, but the DNA is separated from the rest of the cell. And all that means is that the DNA is inside of the nucleus. In prokaryotic cells, the DNA is just hanging out and it's not separate from the rest of the cell. But in a eukaryotic cell, that DNA is kind of hidden in the nucleus. The organelles, they have membranes. They are larger. So eukaryotic cells typically are more larger, more complex. And so examples of eukaryotic cells are plants, animals, fungi, and proteins. Again, the biggest takeaway we want to take from these two slides is what one has, the other does not. So prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, whereas eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus. And just other characteristics, eukaryotic cells are complex and larger, and prokaryotic cells are smaller and simpler. Now, remember, no matter if we're talking about a prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell, they both have DNA, they both have cell membranes, and they both have cytoplasm. So how do we learn the difference between the two? All right. So you can say that one is pro-no and the other one is you do. Okay. So again, I want you to say that out loud with me. Pro-no and you do. Well, what do you think that means? Exactly. Prokaryotic cells are represented by pro-no because they have no nucleus. On the other hand, eukaryotic cells are represented by you do because they do have a nucleus. And that's the biggest identifier of the difference between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell, the presence of a nucleus. All right. All right, so we're going to look at this eukaryotic cell, and we're just going to identify some things that we learned in today's presentation. So you can use your foldable. I'll ask you a couple questions, and I want you to give me the answer back. So let's start with, how about we start with types of eukaryotic cells? So what organisms tend to have a eukaryotic cell? And so you have some objects here, or some organisms here, algae, animals, bacteria, protozoa, fungi, and plants. So out of these 6, can you tell me an organism that's typically a eukaryotic cell? Right, I heard a cow. I also heard algae. Okay, yep, I heard protozoa. Very good. Yes, fungi. Do we see any more? Absolutely, plants. Very good. So those are all types of organisms that have eukaryotic cells. So let's talk about the presence of membrane organelles. Would we find that in a eukaryotic cell? Yes, we would. So we're going to move the yes. Perfect. Now, when we're talking about eukaryotic cells, are we talking about organisms that are unicellular, multicellular, or both? Correct again. If we're talking about an organism that has eukaryotic cells, they can either be unicellular or they can be multicellular. Very good. Now let's talk about DNA. So how does the DNA look in a eukaryotic cell? Correct. The DNA is kind of linear. And then where is it located typically? Right. It is typically located in the nucleus. Excellent job. All right. And so we're going to label a couple of these organelles. So we know that this is pointing to the nucleus. We also know that this square is pointing to the cytoplasm. And then last but not least, we know we have our cell membrane. I'm just going to write membrane. All right, so this would be some information that you want to learn about a eukaryotic cell. They can be organisms like plants, algae, animals. They have membrane-bound organelles. They can be either unicellular, multicellular. They have organelles like a nucleus, a cell membrane, a cytoplasm, and the DNA is located in the nucleus. Well, now that we know what a eukaryotic cell is, let's talk about a prokaryotic cell. So we're going to do some of the same questions that we did before. Well, let's start with what type of organisms are typically prokaryotic? And we have the same list as we have before. So we have bacteria, animals, protozoa, fungi, algae, and plants. So out of those 6, which organisms are typically prokaryotic? Right, out of these 6, the one that's typically prokaryotic is only bacteria. So now that we know what type of organisms are typically prokaryotic, are they mostly unicellular or multicellular? Or could they even be both? So which one should we check for prokaryotic cells? Right, as stated earlier, prokaryotic cells are usually simple and not as complex. So they're mostly made up of unicellular organisms made up of just one cell. Now that we know that they're unicellular, we know that they're bacteria, do these cells contain membrane-bound organelles? Yes or no? No, they do not. So the answer to this question would be no. Now let's talk about the DNA. We need to identify the structure and also the location. So what is the typical structure of DNA for a prokaryotic cell? Correct. It is in a circular shape, and then the location is in the nucleoid, which just means it's all around. And then we can identify some additional organelles. So we know that we are going to have our cell membrane. So I'll put membrane here. We also know that we'll have our cytoplasm. And then we know that this arrow is pointing to our DNA. All right, well, let's review some of the things that we did in this one and in our presentation by playing a little bit of quizzes. So we'll do a few questions and then we'll end today's session with our star practice questions. So what type of cells are humans made up of? Plant, prokaryotic, or eukaryotic? Right, that answer would be eukaryotic. Where is DNA found in a prokaryotic cell? Right, DNA in a prokaryotic cell is loose. It's just hanging out. Which types of cells are only unicellular? Right, again, the type of cell that's mostly unicellular is a prokaryotic cell. Contains ribosomes. So which one contains ribosomes? Prokaryotic, neither, both, or eukaryotic, right? Ribosomes are mostly in both. And we'll do one more. Contains a nucleus. So which types of cells contain nucleus? Prokaryotic, eukaryotic, or both? Yes, a nucleus is typically only found in a eukaryotic cell. And so we're going to end today's session with our STAR practice question so that we can master our STAR exam, regardless if we took it already or if we're taking the makeup online later this month or in June. So the question I have for you today, which list of characteristics describes organelles classified as animals? So if we're talking about a dog, a cow, what would we classify them as? Well, yes, today we learned that animals are eukaryotic. So we know our answer choice is either G, H, or J. Now, what else do we know about animals? Right, we also know that animals are multicellular. They have a lot of cells. So we know our answer is now either G or J. So are animals heterotrophic, meaning they are consumers, or J, autotrophic? Right, the answer to this question is G. Thank you so much for everything that you did for today's session. I appreciate all the participation. I'll see you next week. Have a great week and bye-bye.